Welcome to EPG Pathashala. I am Dr. Shanti, visiting faculty, Vivekananda Institute for Leadership Development, freelance social science researcher based in Mysuru. The module Hegemony, Consensus and Marginalization is part of the Education and Society course. Education is the magic wand, the panacea, the cure for all the ills. Education is learning of human values. It is continuation of the skills of the group. These are some of the famous statements made by leaders around the globe. Each of these leaders has looked at education from different perspectives and angles. Each statement has been made in the background of the social and political conditions of the given society. These statements acquire meaning in the Indian scenario with the introduction of the modern education ideologies. Modern education in the Indian context is a product of the colonial rule in the mid-19th century. The education system earlier to this period, which was of an indigenous variety, was closely aligned with the local occupational structure, which in turn coincided with the caste stratification in society. It is through the institution of education that societies strive to reach the set goals and the expected levels of development. Political backdrop of education brings forth the power hierarchies that are prevalent in any given society in general and India in particular. The Indian Constitution gives immense importance to educating its young citizens. This module tries to look into the complex interplay between consensus and hegemony in education provided to the masses, how and why a set of ideologies is put forward through curriculum, and how the fruits of education and its impact are lost for some sections of the society, resulting in marginalization. Now let us understand how hegemony uses consensus and results in marginalization. The term hegemony means leadership or dominance, especially by the one state or social group over others. Hegemony symbolizes political or cultural dominance or authority over others. For example, the hegemony of the popular kids over other students in the school means that they determine what is cool and what is not cool. Hegemony comes from the Greek word hegemon, which means leader. Hegemony is also understood in relation to economic positions. For example, wealthy lender nations, hoping to determine political outcomes and trade decisions, have established hegemony over the debtor nations they lend to. Hegemony actually refers to the ways by which people in power use their power to control public perception in a way that ensures that they will stay in power. The rich and the dominant groups, certain situations in which the poor and subordinate begin to think and behave in a way that reinforces the dominance of the wealthy and the subordinate status and vulnerability of the poor. Hegemony is a system where one ruling social group or state rearranges a system in such a way that its dominance is seen as justifiable. In other words, it gains consent for dominance. The concept of cultural hegemony is particularly associated with Antonio Gramsci. It is the idea that the ruling class can manipulate and value systems and mores of a society so that its view becomes the world view. As Eigel notes, Gramsci normally uses the word hegemony to mean the ways in which a governing power wins consent to its rule from those it subjugates. In contrast to authoritarian rule, cultural hegemony is hegemonic only if those affected by it also consent to and struggle over its common sense. Gramsci used the concept hegemony to denote the predominance of one social class over others. Power in most societies is not maintained through overt force. The powerful in most modern societies legitimize their views and make these views virtually unquestionable by constantly repeating them through the varied official sources like schools, textbooks, teachers in the school rules, media outlets, mainstream news organizations, and less official sources like parents, peers, religious heads, entertainment outlets, and many like these, as noted by White. Gramsci's idea of hegemony or ideological domination is one of the greatest contributions in understanding the use of power in society. In a given society, when one ideology or worldview point dominates, it suppresses or eliminates, often unkindly, any other viewpoints explaining reality. Hegemony could contain varied ideological expressions. Some are artificial, like theoretical explanations created by academics or political activists or some philosophers. Other ideologies are organic, which means that they come from the common people's lived experiences. These consist of a culture's way of seeing and believing, and the people's lived experiences through institutions that uphold them, like religion, education, family, and media. Through these beliefs and institutions, society endorses the ethical beliefs and manners which the powers that be agree are true or right or logical or moral. The institutions and beliefs that the dominant culture support is so powerful and get hold of people when they are so young that alternative ways of envisioning reality are very hard to imagine. This is how hegemony is created and maintained. According to Gramsci, hegemony locks up society tightly because of the way ideas are transmitted by using language. At this junction, it is important to note that education does not exist as a superstructure, but is a substructure of the superstructures, mainly the government, but directed by politics and economy. As Nagaraju notes, education in a given society evolves into a role subordinate to a dominant structure in its operational surroundings. It can never be a superordinate structure, as it has to depend upon the resources provided by other structures in the society. Since educational outcomes have consequences on the stability or change in the dominant structure, there is strife, competition for controlling education. This competition generates politics of education from outside, resulting in educational policy. Education does not exist in a vacuum. It interacts with multiple systems in a society. This is also very much true of Indian society. Before the British introduced a universal system of education, the education system that existed in India was patronized by the upper jatis. A larger majority of the population, which was placed in the lower rungs of the caste hierarchy, was excluded from the process of knowledge acquisition. This is clearly a power-related issue. It is in this background that we need to understand the terms consensus and hegemony in relation to knowledge, considered by the larger society as an instrument for evolving, adapting, and surviving. All education is political in nature. Educational policies are shaped by dominant and powerful political and economic factors. Schooling played an important part in Gramsci's analysis of modern society. The school system was just one part of the system of ideological hegemony in which individuals were socialized into maintaining the status quo. Gramsci describes the social character of the traditional schools as determined by the fact that each social groups throughout society has its own type of social school intended to perpetuate a specific traditional functioning, ruling or subordinate one. The hegemonic education mode in modern Italy, Gramsci notes, was one in which the mass of the population was kept in its place. In order to transform this situation, the education system had to be confronted and changed dramatically. He observes, he was very well aware of the up mountain climb this would be. The dominance of the political regime as an external factor is not the only form of hegemony that appears in an educational system. Nagaraju writes in his discussions on political economy of education, in reality, there is no easy way in which hegemonic values could give way for egalitarian conditions to exist in the education system. Textbooks are prescribed by the state, which also determines the nature of content to be conveyed through these textbooks. Further, the evidence we have from Darak's work, Prescribed Marginalization, brings forth the fact that the content in textbooks provided by the state. He writes that textbook material is regarded as the only valid knowledge to be imparted to students. The constitution and composition of textbooks are conscious decisions of small groups of people, usually consisting of representatives of the state and the state-approved experts. Although textbooks are products of social compromises and negotiations, it is observed that dominant social classes use textbook as a tool for protecting their interests and safeguarding their power. He further quotes Apple, says, "The curriculum is never simply a neutral assemblage of knowledge, somehow appearing in the texts and classrooms of a nation. It is always part of a selective tradition, someone's selection and some group's vision of legitimate knowledge. The decision to define some group's knowledge as the most legitimate, as official knowledge, while other groups' knowledge hardly sees the light of day, says something extremely important about who has power in society." Educating children as future citizens is most vital component for any government. Through the institution of school and college, the governments try to shape and build notions of expected and acceptable citizenship. Industrialized India grew into a society which placed importance on industrial production, followed by service-providing industries, predominantly those involving information and knowledge as the major source of economy. The changing needs of societies always finds expressions in what youngsters are taught through both informal and formal mode of training. This has become all the more pronounced in a global society status that we are all being roped into. Globalization has reaffirmed the hegemonic policies with relation to education. This gets more pronounced in developing countries' layered developmental process. For societies seeking to bring about directed change, it becomes desirable to have a broad support for change. This leads to consensus. Consensus means a general agreement about something, an idea or opinion that is shared by all the people in a group. Using Fiske's example, we can understand the role of consensus in education. Fiske, while discussing the decentralization of education, demonstrates the effect of presence and absence of consensus it brings in change. Gramsci added another dimension to the definition of hegemony, that is, domination by consent. It seems impossible that any would consent to be oppressed, or that we ourselves might be consenting to oppress others. But no matter how outraged we are at the poverty that exists in the richest country in the world, what almost all of us do to fight it is just to tinker with the system. We know that the rich are getting richer, while the poor and the middle class are feeling less and less secure. We know, but we accept. What can one person do? We keep asking. The poor have always been with us. It's a fatalistic feeling we have, but Gramsci doesn't blame us for it. Indeed, he says, fatalism is nothing but other than the clothing worn by real and active will when in a weaker position. As a society's heterogeneity increases, so does the problem in generating consensus. Hegemony, to a great extent, depends on consensus. Hegemony is perpetuated because it is everywhere, but unspoken and implicit. People are very rarely aware that they are being manipulated. As Apple reminds us, hegemonies are co-constructed entities whose ability to guide and control society is not using coercion, but rather on consent from the oppressed, by creating an ideological umbrella that under which different groups who usually might not totally agree with each other can stand and argue. Hegemonies are reinforced. White is of the opinion that hegemonies succeed in forging consensus where more overtly coercive forms of repression fail. In the case of educational hegemony, the system is constructed of neoconservatives, neoliberals, cultural elite, and a public fearful of loss of place in an ever-changing world order that are beyond the uneasy yet powerful alliance. Educational system echoes the values and practices of the larger society. If the larger society is sexist, racist, and based on economic, cultural, and historical inequalities, it is unrealistic to expect educational systems to be devoid of these inequalities. Educational systems, after all, are the formal, institutionalized, systematized vehicles through which the larger society socializes youth to the values held by the dominant or the ruling groups. It is here the expressions of marginalization emerges. Training imparted within the educational system very often, very subtly prepare the recipients for unconditional acceptance of values of dominant groups as legitimate knowledge. This is disadvantageous to the traditionally marginalized or oppressed sections of society, like for example in India, which comprises of women, scheduled castes, and other backward castes, Adivasis or the tribal communities, religious minorities. It is in this background that Darak looks into the textbooks from Maharashtra and documents a series of dominant cultural values having political sanctions. Taking different examples from different textbooks, Darak shows how hegemonies marginalizes. He talks of marginalization of women by citing examples of their depiction in stereotypical roles which systematically reinforces in the minds of the young the secondary citizen positions that women occupy. He writes that women are generally portrayed as carriers and reproducers of tradition. The emphasis is almost always on their child-rearing responsibilities. Darak notes that girls are socialized to accept gender stereotypes both in the family and in school. Textbooks most often uphold these gender stereotypes because They project behavior patterns that do not challenge established notions and practices of gendered behavior. A critical analysis of textbooks through multiple lenses with reference to gender, caste, religion, rural and poor illustrates how and why textbooks are argued to be vehicles propagating the ideology of the dominant groups and ruling classes. There has been a recent shift in the attitude of at least a few textbooks because we see a representation being given to subaltern writers. Interestingly, the textbook analysis put forward by Darak shows that there is a difference in the language used by Dalit writers and those of the higher caste and different treatment for these writers. He notes that the exercises at the end of the lessons ask the students to identify the words in local dialect and give the words in standard Marathi. He also draws our attention to the fact that the exercises at the end of the lessons written by dominant jatis have asked the students to appreciate the beauty of the language used. If there is a will to reform the education system, to build the capability of our young, to identify and discuss different phases of social marginalization, it could create an environment for challenging hegemonies as well as ending marginalization. What the young require to be exposed are alternate role models. As a way of summing up, we can say that in all the periods of human history, we get to see a pattern of hierarchy. In each of these patterns, there is the dominance of the ideologies of some over the large masses, a process guided and controlled through education. The modern education system has fortunately emerged as a more rational and just when compared to its earlier version. Cultural hegemony continues to hold the education system in its sway and tries to influence the thoughts and actions of the stakeholders through textbooks and teaching strategies. Government policies often mirror the ideologies of the dominant groups who are situated in positions of power. The voices of the marginalized are barely reflected in many educational messages and practices. Unless we make a conscious effort to question and protest hegemony in our education system and encourage dissent, education simply becomes a tool in the hands of the powerful to force consensus and reinforce marginalization.